There is a town in Europe where you can cross an international border 60 times in the space of a few kilometers, and nobody will stamp your passport, because the line runs right through the middle of people's living rooms. That same border has not been fully agreed upon for most of its existence. A deal struck between two medieval lords in the year 1198 is, in a very literal legal sense, still determining which country your kitchen belongs to right now in the 21st century. Lawyers and cartographers spent decades trying to untangle it. In the end, the best solution anyone could come up with was to individually assign sovereignty to 5,732 separate pieces of ground. And during the First World War, when Germany occupied Belgium and thought it had silenced the country's entire communication network, someone used one small pocket of this border to smuggle in a military radio transmitter, piece by piece, disguised as equipment for a refugee camp, and aimed it straight at the German lines. The Germans were furious. They were also completely powerless to stop it. And the reason why is something that mapmakers in the Middle Ages could never possibly have predicted. This is Baarle. And it is the most genuinely absurd border on the surface of the earth. The town sits in the southern Netherlands, about 45 miles northeast of Antwerp. From a distance, it looks completely ordinary. A church, a market square, some cafes, a modest town hall. Brick houses with neat gardens. Nothing about the skyline suggests that you are looking at the single most cartographically complicated place in the modern world. But look down at the pavement, and you start to see them, small white crosses embedded in the stone, tracing a line that winds, doubles back, cuts through doorways and across shop floors and diagonally through the center of at least one council chamber. Those crosses mark an international border. Specifically, they mark the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. And in Baarle, that border does not go where any sane person would expect it to go. The town is actually two towns simultaneously. Baarle-Nassau is Dutch. Baarle-Hertog is Belgian. They occupy the same physical space. They share the same streets, the same cafes, the same square. But legally, administratively, and in terms of which government can tax your property and police your street, they are two entirely separate municipalities in two entirely separate countries. Each has its own mayor. Each has its own town hall, the Belgian one built directly straddling an enclave boundary, with that LED border line embedded in the floor of the council chamber, so that when the mayor calls a vote, half the room is technically in one nation and half in another. Each has its own police force. Each collects its own income tax. Together they are home to about 10,000 people, and some of those people step across an international boundary every time they answer the front door. But here is where ordinary becomes extraordinary. Baarle-Hertog, the Belgian part, is not simply a single Belgian enclave sitting inside Dutch territory. It is 22 of them. 22 separate, disconnected pieces of Belgium, scattered across the Dutch municipality like an explosion in a jigsaw factory. The largest is big enough to hold the town center. The smallest is roughly the size of half a football pitch. They are not connected to each other on the ground. Each one is a sovereign fragment of Belgium, ringed entirely by the Netherlands. And nested inside 7 of those Belgian fragments are Dutch counter-enclaves, pieces of the Netherlands, inside Belgium, inside the Netherlands. A country within a country within a country, 3 layers deep, repeated across the same few square kilometers of quiet Brabant countryside. Visiting every enclave on foot would mean crossing the Dutch-Belgian international border 60 times. Children who grew up here describe walking to school as a routine that involved crossing into Belgium, back into the Netherlands, into Belgium again, without a single gate or checkpoint. Just white crosses in the pavement, and a different flag painted above the door numbers. Now, the natural question is, how does something like this happen? Because this is not an accident of modern politics. It is not the result of a war, a referendum, or a disputed election. It is the legacy of a single afternoon's business in the year 1198, when 2 medieval lords were trying to avoid a much bigger war and made a deal that nobody thought would outlast the century, let alone survive into the age of GPS and European Union membership. The story begins with a power struggle. In the late 12th century, 2 of the most powerful lords in the Low Countries were pressing against each other for territory. Duke Hendrik I of Brabant and Count Dirk VII of Holland both had their eyes on a strategically positioned domain called Breda. Caught between them was a relatively minor lord named Godfried II of Schoten, the Lord of Breda, who understood that he could not hold his position alone. He needed a protector. In 1198, Godfried made his choice. He sided with the Duke of Brabant. He transferred ownership of his entire domain to Duke Hendrik as a formal gesture of submission, which prevented the Count of Holland from pressing his own claim. Then, immediately, Hendrik returned most of it to Godfried as a feudal lease, a standard medieval arrangement that let Godfried keep running his lands while acknowledging Brabant's ultimate authority. It was a political maneuver dressed up as a property transaction. It worked. The war was avoided. But the Duke was not naive. Before handing the land back, he quietly retained the parcels he found most valuable for himself, specifically the ones that were already cultivated, already generating agricultural tax revenue. The uncultivated heathland and the rougher plots went to Godfried. The productive strips and settled parcels stayed under the Duke's direct control. Nobody at the time thought this division was anything other than routine estate management. The Duke kept the good farmland. The Lord got back the rest. People went home. Over the following centuries, through inheritances and wars and the slow redrawing of European power, the Lord's territories passed to the House of Nassau, giving the Dutch side of Baarle its name, while the Duke's retained parcels remained attached to the Duchy of Brabant, eventually becoming part of the southern Netherlands, and then Belgium when Belgium gained its independence in 1830. The two sides of the division were now, suddenly, in two different countries. And nobody had thought to straighten the boundaries first. What followed was one of the longest and most painful boundary negotiations in European history. The border between Belgium and the Netherlands was formally established in the 1843 Treaty of Maastricht. Straightforward enough, in theory. Except in Baarle. In Baarle, the situation was so complex that the standard method of drawing a line simply did not apply. Instead, diplomats and surveyors had to go parcel by parcel, assigning sovereignty to 5,732 individual pieces of ground. It took 15 years just to get the markers in place. And even then, one small rectangular field on the edge of the village was left completely unassigned, a cartographic orphan that sat in legal limbo for over a century, until 1995, when it was finally designated as Belgian territory and became the 22nd enclave. That is not a typo. The border of Baarle was not fully settled until 1995. Now, the absurdity of this arrangement creates practical consequences that compound into something almost comic. Under Belgian and Dutch law, the nationality of a building is determined by the location of its front door. If your front door opens onto Belgian territory, you live in Belgium, pay Belgian taxes, and are policed by Belgian officers, even if your bedroom is in the Netherlands and your kitchen is technically in a different country. This rule has led, over the years, to homeowners physically relocating their front doors in order to shift which country's tax code applies to their property. Not metaphorically. Literally picking up the door, moving it to the other side of the house, and filing the paperwork. One restaurant that sat directly on the border operated in two legal jurisdictions simultaneously. There was a period when Dutch law required restaurants to close earlier than Belgian law. The solution for at least one establishment was straightforward. When Dutch closing time arrived, staff simply asked customers to move their tables to the Belgian side of the room. Same building. Same food. Same staff. Different country. Still open. The town's relationship with its absurd geography has produced a kind of cheerful pragmatism. Locals grow up crossing nations the way other people cross streets. The tourist office, which sits in the Netherlands, is shared between the Dutch and Belgian municipalities, because of course it is. The border markers in the pavement are mapped and maintained as a point of civic pride. The town actually describes itself as Europe in miniature. And for the most part, the arrangement works. 2 mayors, 2 police forces, 2 tax offices, and somewhere around 24 enclaves, all coexisting in a space that takes about 20 minutes to walk across. But there is one chapter in this town's history where its bizarre geography stopped being comic and became something genuinely remarkable, where those 22 fragments of Belgium, stranded inside the Netherlands, became one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate on the Western Front. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, the occupation was swift and total. Within weeks, most of the country was under German military control. But the German army had a strict constraint: the Netherlands was neutral. Germany could not enter Dutch territory without triggering Dutch entry into the war, which was the last thing German strategic planners wanted. Dutch neutrality was sacrosanct, and German forces were ordered to respect it. And that meant that the Belgian enclaves inside the Dutch municipality of Baarle could not be occupied. Not 1 square meter of them. The Imperial German army could march through Belgium, could cut telegraph lines, could blockade cities, but it could not cross into the Netherlands to reach 22 scattered fragments of Belgian soil surrounded entirely by neutral Dutch territory. Those tiny pockets of Belgium were, by pure geographic accident, the one part of occupied Belgium that German soldiers could not legally touch. The Dutch government understood the sensitivity of the situation. They fenced off the enclave areas and controlled movement in and out. Belgian civilians sheltered there, refugees from the occupation who had slipped across the border into the neutral Netherlands and could live in the enclaves under their own flag. The Belgian Postal Service even kept operating, with mail routed through the Baarle-Hertog post office reaching Belgian soldiers at the front, bypassing the entire German occupation network. But what happened next was something altogether more daring. A Belgian lieutenant named Paul Goldschmidt was tasked with establishing a military communications station that could reach the Belgian lines without German interception. His team began smuggling components into the Belgian enclave, piece by piece, disguised as construction materials for a refugee camp. Zinc plates for grounding. Electrical coils. And then the main event, dozens of 18-meter ship masts, transported through the town by a local craftsman pushing them in his handcart, one load at a time. When assembled, the masts formed a central antenna tower 40 meters tall, rising over the rooftops of an otherwise quiet market town. The station was called Zenstation MN7. From 1915 until the armistice in November 1918, it operated continuously, exchanging coded messages with the Belgian resistance, tracking enemy signals including transmissions from German Zeppelins, and jamming German communications. The Germans knew it was there. They could see the antenna. They were, according to every account, genuinely furious. They were also completely and permanently unable to do anything about it, because the station sat on Belgian soil surrounded by neutral Dutch territory, and there was no legal mechanism under which they could enter and destroy it. The Zenstation MN7 operated without a single interruption for the entirety of its wartime existence. A replica antenna mast was unveiled in Baarle-Hertog in 2014, as close as possible to the original location. It does not transmit. But it stands there, 40 meters in the air, in the middle of an ordinary-looking neighborhood, as a permanent reminder that an 800-year-old land deal accidentally created one of the most effective military communications outposts of the First World War. The 20th century was not finished testing the town's border arrangements. During the Second World War, both Belgium and the Netherlands were occupied by Germany, which eliminated the enclave advantage entirely. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the border's practical absurdity reasserted itself in a way that made international headlines. Belgium imposed one of Europe's strictest early lockdowns. The Netherlands adopted what it called an intelligent quarantine, considerably more permissive. In Baarle, this meant that 2 residents living across the street from each other, one Dutch and one Belgian, were legally subject to entirely different sets of rules. Shops on the Dutch side of a street could stay open while shops a few meters away on the Belgian side had to close. In one art gallery split down the middle by the border, customers entering from the Belgian entrance were required by Belgian law to wear a mask. A few steps further inside, once they had technically crossed into Dutch territory, that requirement dropped away. The local mayor was quoted saying simply, "Nobody knows what to do." The authorities eventually asked all residents to follow whichever country's rules were stricter. Legally, the instruction was unenforceable. But people mostly understood, and mostly followed it. And that, in a quiet way, says something important about Baarle that the maps cannot capture. The town has been navigating jurisdictional absurdity for over 800 years. Medieval lords, Napoleonic-era border commissions, wartime generals, pandemic health ministries, all of them have run into the same problem. The geography of Baarle does not bend to administrative convenience. It was not designed for the modern concept of a nation-state. It predates that concept by centuries. And yet somehow, the people who live there have always found a way to make it work. 2 mayors share a building. 2 police forces coordinate on crimes that start in one country and end in another. Children walk to school across borders before they are old enough to have passports. The border at Baarle is a reminder of something the clean lines on most maps quietly obscure, that sovereignty is, at its root, a human invention layered over a world that does not naturally organize itself into neat rectangles. Somewhere in the middle of the Netherlands, in a town that 2 different countries both call their own, 22 pieces of Belgium are still exactly where a medieval duke left them. And they will almost certainly still be there long after any map drawn today has been redrawn. Some borders are drawn. Some are fought over. And some are inherited, piece by piece, from an afternoon's negotiation in 1198, and then left, essentially unchanged, for the next 8 centuries, for the world to spend the rest of eternity trying to explain.